The wagon wheel cracked clean in half on the first mile past the New Mexico Territory border, and Anna Wallace decided right then that this land was either going to break her or build her into something worth keeping. She had not planned on arriving in Cutter's Creek the way she did, sitting sideways on a borrowed mule with a cast iron pot balanced across her knees and a carpetbag strapped to her back like some kind of traveling contradiction. She had planned on arriving with dignity, with her mother's recipe box tucked safely under her arm, and her chin lifted exactly the way her grandmother Edith had always lifted hers, as though the world owed her nothing but she expected good manners anyway. Instead, she arrived with road dust in her teeth and a bruise forming on her left hip from where the wagon's side panel had caught her when the wheel gave way. It was the spring of 1878, and the New Mexico Territory was not a gentle place. It was a land of sunburned red rock and scrub brush, of wind that came from nowhere and went everywhere, of men who wore their desperation like a second coat and women who were rare enough that their arrival in any town caused a kind of stillness. The way a stone dropped into a pond causes everything to rearrange itself around the disruption. Anna was 24 years old. She had dark chestnut hair that she kept pinned back firmly, hazel eyes that shifted between brown and green depending on the light, and a jaw that her mother had always called stubborn and her grandmother had always called sensible. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and she carried herself like someone who had grown up understanding that the world would not soften itself for her convenience. She had come from Missouri, from the small town of Harrisburg, where her mother Clara had run a boarding house and cooked 3 meals a day for miners, travelers, and the occasional circuit preacher. Clara Wallace had died the previous autumn from a fever that came on fast and stayed too long, and Anna had spent the winter settling debts and selling furniture and coming to the slow, clarifying conclusion that there was nothing left in Missouri to stay for. Her grandmother Edith was already gone, had been gone 5 years, but she had left Anna something more durable than money. She had left her an attitude toward hardship that could best be described as, get up, keep moving, and don't let anyone see you waver unless you mean it. The recipe box was the last physical thing of her mother's that Anna owned. It was a cedar box with a tin clasp, about the size of a Bible, and it held 37 recipe cards in Clara Wallace's careful handwriting. Molasses bread, black-eyed pea soup, fried apple hand pies, slow-cooked short ribs with dried chili peppers and brown sugar. The kind of food that made people feel like someone had thought of them specifically. Anna had read those cards so many times she had them memorized, but she carried the box anyway because holding something her mother had touched felt important in a way she couldn't quite put into words. She had heard about Cutter's Creek from a man named Doyle Fletcher who had stopped at the Harrisburg boarding house on his way back from a cattle drive. He had eaten 3 helpings of her mother's black-eyed pea soup and declared it the finest thing he'd tasted west of the Mississippi. And then he'd told her that the town of Cutter's Creek in the New Mexico Territory had no eating establishment whatsoever, that the 24 men working the land grants and cattle operations nearby had nowhere to get a proper meal, and that the first person sensible enough to open a cookhouse there would make a comfortable living within a year. Anna had filed that information away the way her grandmother would have, practically and without sentimentality, and when Missouri ran out of reasons to keep her, she pulled out that piece of information and acted on it. The mule's name was Gerald, according to the man who had lent it to her after the wagon wheel incident, a weathered freighter named Obie who was headed in the opposite direction and could not spare more time. Gerald walked with a sideways lean that suggested personal opinions about his direction, but he got her to Cutter's Creek by late afternoon. The town was smaller than she had imagined and larger than she had feared. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 rises of red clay land, with a main street that was really just a wide dirt track flanked by a general store, a livery stable, a land office, a saloon that looked like it had been built in a hurry and never quite forgiven for it, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a scattering of wooden structures that served purposes she hadn't yet determined. There were perhaps 40 people in town on a regular basis. She would later learn, with ranchers and cowhands from the surrounding area swelling that number considerably on Fridays and Saturdays. She rode Gerald down the main street at the pace of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, which was the first lesson her grandmother had taught her. Look certain even when you are not, because uncertainty invites interference. The first person to speak to her was an older woman named Berta Holt, who was sweeping the porch of what turned out to be the general store. Berta was somewhere in her 60s, built like a fence post that had decided to be comfortable about it, with sharp blue eyes and a posture that suggested she had once been taller and was not particularly bothered by the change. "You lost," Berta called out, not unkindly. "I'm looking for a place to set up a cook-house," Anna said from Gerald's back, and something about the way she said it, flat and direct and without apology, made Berta stop sweeping. "You cook?" Berta asked. "Better than anyone in this town, I'd wager," Anna said, and she did not mean it as a boast. She meant it as a reasonable assessment based on available information. Berta looked at her for a long moment, then tilted her head toward a low building at the far end of the main street, near the church. "That building there used to be a harness repair shop. Man who owned it went back east 2 winters ago. Doors been unlocked for a year." That was how Anna Wallace arrived in Cutter's Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878. She met James Redmond on her 3rd day in town. She had spent the first day hauling the harness shop into some order, which involved removing an impressive collection of abandoned leather straps, a dead sparrow, and approximately 30 years of accumulated dust. She borrowed a broom from Berta, who also provided her with coffee, and the names of everyone in town, along with short editorial assessments of their characters. She spent the 2nd day making a list of what she needed, negotiating with Berta for supplies on credit, and cooking a test batch of her mother's molasses bread in the small iron stove she found pushed against the back wall, which worked once she cleared the chimney pipe of a bird's nest. She set the bread on the windowsill to cool on the morning of the 3rd day, and by noon there were 4 men standing outside the door looking hungry and uncertain, the way men do when they smell something good and are not sure of the protocol. She opened the door and told them to come in and sit down, which they did, and she fed them bread and a soup she had made from salt pork and dried beans, and a generous hand of the dried red chili peppers she had found in a paper sack on the shelf above the stove, leftover from whoever had worked here before. It was while she was ladling soup into the 4th bowl that the door opened again, and James Redmond walked in. She noticed him the way you notice a change in the weather, not because it announces itself loudly, but because something in the air shifts. He was 30 years old, tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the door frame, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than any deliberate effort toward it. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting, a jaw that was shadowed with several days of growth, and eyes that were a very particular shade of brown, the color of creek water in the late afternoon when the sun is low, warm and deep, and with something still going on underneath. He wore a worn canvas coat over a blue shirt, denim trousers, and boots that had seen real mileage. There was a battered hat in his hands because he had apparently had the reflex to take it off when he came inside, and he was turning it slowly by the brim the way men do when they're thinking about something. He looked at the room, at the 4 men eating at the rough table she had put together from 2 sawhorses and a plank of wood, at the pot on the stove and the bread on the windowsill, and then he looked at Anna, and something happened in the expression on his face that she would think about later when she was alone. It wasn't a dramatic thing. It was more like recognition, the small shift of someone seeing something they hadn't known they were looking for. "I heard there was food," he said. His voice was low and straightforward, a Missouri or Kansas accent she thought rounded at the edges. "There is," Anna said. "Sit down." He sat. She fed him. He ate 2 bowls of the soup and 3 slices of bread, which she noted, and then he folded his hands around the tin mug of coffee she set in front of him and looked at her across the room with an expression that was thoughtful and direct and not at all intrusive. "You make this?" he asked. "I did," she said. "Where'd you learn?" "My mother," she said. "She had a boarding house in Missouri." He nodded as though this confirmed something. "Where is she now?" "She passed last fall," Anna said simply, because grief was a fact and not a performance. He looked at her steadily for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the kind of "I'm sorry" that doesn't try to add anything to itself, which she appreciated more than elaboration. "James Redmond," he said, and extended his hand across the room toward her as he stood, which meant he had to lean awkwardly over the table, and she stepped forward to meet him halfway and shook it. His hand was calloused and warm, and he shook hers the way you shake someone's hand when you're treating them as an equal, firmly and without condescension. "Anna Wallace," she said. "Are you staying?" he asked. "In Cutter's Creek." "I intend to," she said. He nodded again, put his hat back on, left a coin on the table that was a full cent more than she'd told anyone to pay, and walked out into the afternoon light. The man sitting closest to the door, a rancher's hand named Cliff, who had been first in line on all 3 days, watched James go and then looked at Anna with a knowing sort of expression that she chose to ignore. James Redmond, she learned from Berta Holt over the following days, was not from the territory originally. He had come west from Kansas about 4 years prior, had worked on 2 cattle operations, and now ran a modest ranch operation of his own about 2 miles outside town, 40 head of cattle, and a claim on a section of grazing land that he was slowly turning into something with enough fence posts and patience. He was known around town as a reliable man, the kind who showed up when he said he would, paid his debts, and did not require a great deal of managing. He had a reputation for being quiet, which some people mistook for coldness and others recognized as economy, as the habit of not speaking unless you had something worth saying. He came back to Anna's cookhouse every day that week. Then every day the following week. By the 3rd week, she had learned to save him the end piece of whatever bread she made that day, because she had noticed he always glanced at it, and she had decided that was interesting information worth acting on. She placed it at the spot where he always sat without being asked, and the first time she did it, he looked at the bread and then up at her with an expression that could only be described as caught. And then he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that started slowly and went all the way, and Anna Wallace felt something happen in the center of her chest that she told herself was none of her practical business. She had not come to the New Mexico territory to fall in love. She had come to build something for herself, to take her mother's recipes and her grandmother's stubbornness and make them into an establishment, into a life that stood on its own. Love was not on her list of required materials, but the heart is notoriously poor at reading lists. The cookhouse was doing well. Within the first month, she had a regular lunchtime crowd of 8 to 12 men, mostly ranch hands and the men who worked at the land office and the livery. She had introduced a weekly special, usually something from her mother's recipe cards that required more preparation: the slow-cooked short ribs on Tuesdays, the fried apple hand pies on Fridays, which had rapidly become the most anticipated event in Cutter's Creek's limited social calendar. She had bought a second table from a man who was leaving his claim and heading to Colorado, and she had made curtains from a bolt of checked cotton that Berta had given her at cost because Berta had decided, in the direct and efficient way that Berta decided things, that Anna Wallace was good for this town. She was making enough to pay for her supplies and put a small amount aside each week, not a great amount, but growing. She had patched the roof herself with help from an older man named Pete Colby, who had been a carpenter before his hand stiffened up, and together they had fixed the 2 worst windows and replaced a section of the flooring that had gone soft with damp. It was a good, honest life that was forming around her, and she held it together with the same careful determination she put into everything, the grandmother's backbone that she had carried here across the length of the country. The trouble started on a Wednesday in June, when a man named Fletcher Haynes rode into town. Haynes was not the original Doyle Fletcher who had told her about Cutter's Creek. This was a different man entirely, a land speculator from Santa Fe who had arrived with papers and a self-satisfied expression, and the information that the building she was operating her cookhouse in had not, in fact, been legally abandoned. He presented documents suggesting that the building belonged to the estate of one Wilbur Crane, the former harness man, and that the estate was now in the hands of a cousin in Ohio, who had retained Haynes to either sell the property or collect rent from anyone occupying it. He sat across from her in the cookhouse with his papers spread on the table during the slow hour between breakfast and lunch, and he quoted her a monthly rent that was nearly double what she had been putting aside. Anna sat across from him and felt the familiar pull of panic and the equally familiar suppression of it that her grandmother had modeled for her so thoroughly that it had become second nature. She studied Haynes's papers carefully, which she could do because her mother had insisted on her education, one of the very few things Clara Wallace had been inflexible about. "I'll need time to review these," she said. "I'll give you until Friday," Haynes said pleasantly, the way a man says something unpleasant when he's decided to dress it in courtesy. He left, and Anna sat alone in her cookhouse and looked at the walls she had cleaned and the floor she had patched and the curtains she had sewn, and she did not cry. Her grandmother would not have cried. She would have made a plan. James came in for lunch at his usual time, and he could read the room with the accuracy of a man who paid attention to things, which he did. He sat down, looked at her, and said, "Something happened." It was not a question. She told him about Haynes and the papers and the rent. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was one of his particular qualities. He did not interrupt because he was actually listening, not waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands. Then he said, "There's a lawyer in Las Vegas, a town about 60 miles north. His name is Ellis Parr. He's handled land disputes in the territory before, and he's an honest man, which is worth saying specifically because not all of them are." "I can't afford a lawyer," Anna said. "He charges what people can pay," James said. "And I can ride up there and speak to him if you want. Save you the trip." She looked at him steadily. "Why would you do that?" He met her eyes and held them for a moment, and there was something in the look that was direct in a way that made her feel seen rather than scrutinized. "Because you've built something here that this town needed before it knew it needed it," he said, "and because it's the right thing to do." He did not say anything about her specifically, not yet. But it was in there, in the way he said it, and she knew it, and she suspected he knew she knew it, and that was its own kind of conversation. He rode to Las Vegas the following morning and came back 2 days later with information that changed things considerably. Ellis Parr had reviewed the documents that James had carried up on Anna's behalf, copies she had made herself from the originals, and had found that Wilbur Crane's estate had in fact reverted to territorial property due to the lapse of the original land claim, which Crane had allowed to expire when he left without renewing it. Haynes's documents were not fraudulent exactly, but they were built on a claim that had a legal floor with a hole in it. Parr had written a letter to this effect, official and precise, which James brought back along with the lawyer's assessment that Haynes would likely not pursue the matter further once he received it. Anna read the letter twice at her cookhouse table with James sitting across from her, and then she looked up at him. "He didn't charge anything?" she asked. "He said to bring him a jar of whatever you make that smells like apple and brown sugar when you're in the territory next time," James said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and James Redmond watched her laugh with an expression on his face that was warm and careful in equal parts, the look of a man who is holding something precious and is aware of how easily things break. She gave Haynes the letter from Parr when he returned on Friday, and he read it twice with narrowing eyes and then folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket and said, "Good day, Miss Wallace," with the clipped tone of a man recalibrating his afternoon, and left. They never saw him again. She told James about it when he came in for lunch that same day, and something eased in her chest when she said the words out loud to someone specific, someone who had been part of the reason it had worked out. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that was larger than the two words, and from the way he received them, quietly and without deflecting, she thought he understood that. Through the summer, the rhythm of their acquaintance became something more particular. He came to the cookhouse daily, but he also began stopping by in the evenings, at first with practical reasons. A fence post she'd mentioned needing, help moving the second table to a better position, and then with less manufactured reasons, simply walking over and sitting on the porch with her in the hour before dark when the New Mexico sky did the extraordinary things it did with color and cloud. They talked. Not all the time, and not always about significant things, but in the way that people who are genuinely interested in each other talk, following the conversation wherever it goes rather than steering it toward a purpose. She learned that he had grown up in Kansas, the second of 3 children, that his father had been a farmer and his mother had been a woman who could stretch a chicken into meals for a week, that he had come west after his father's farm was taken by a bank following a bad drought year, the way so many people had lost things in those years, and that he had decided if he was going to work that hard, he was going to do it for something that was his. He learned about her grandmother Edith, who had apparently been the most formidable woman in Harrisburg, Missouri, the kind of woman who could look at a problem and reduce it to its essential solvable components by sheer force of sensible thought. He learned about her mother Clara and the boarding house, about the recipe box and what was in it, about the 37 cards, and the handwriting that Anna said was like reading her mother's voice. She'd have liked this town, Anna said one evening on the porch, watching the last of the light leave the sky. "Why?" James asked. "Because it's real," Anna said. She never cared much for places that were putting on a show. "This place doesn't put on a show." "It really doesn't," James agreed, and there was something dry and fond in it that made her smile. She began noticing the specific details of him, the way you begin to notice things when something is becoming important to you. The way he stacked his coffee mug on top of his plate when he was done eating, to make it easier for her to clear. The way he always checked the stove when he left in the evenings to make sure it was properly banked, without being asked and without comment. The way he talked to Pete Colby, who was older and sometimes repeated himself, with the same full attention he gave to everyone else. The way he could be completely quiet without it meaning anything was wrong, without silence requiring management. In August, there was a fire. Not in the cookhouse, thank God, but in the livery stable, which caught from a lantern left too close to a hay pile by a careless hand late on a Thursday night. By the time it was visible from the street, a quarter of the stable was burning, and the horses inside were frantic. Anna was the first one out of the cookhouse when the alarm spread, still wearing her working apron, and she joined the line of people passing buckets from the trough behind the general store, while others got the horses out. James was in the middle of it, along with 3 other men, going in and out of the burning structure to lead terrified horses to safety in the street, and she watched him from the bucket line with a concentrated calm that she recognized as the suppression of fear, her hands passing buckets without stopping while some cold part of her counted the times he went in and the times he came out. The fire was contained within an hour, with the far end of the livery lost but the rest saved, and all 12 horses out. James emerged from the last run with his coat scorched along one shoulder and a cut on his cheek from a beam fragment, minor damage, and when he saw her in the line, he stopped walking for a moment. Just a moment, and she stopped handing buckets. Just a moment, and they looked at each other across the smoky dark street with an honesty that had no words around it. She cleaned the cut on his face later that night at the cookhouse table, with clean cloth and the small bottle of carbolic she kept in the supply box, and he sat still for it with the trust of a man who doesn't require being handled carefully because he's already handled himself. She was standing close to do it properly, close enough that she could see the specific features of his face at this range, the cut itself, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw was set but not tense. "This is going to sting," she told him before she applied the carbolic. "I know," he said, not like a warning but like an agreement, and she pressed the cloth to the cut and he breathed through it without moving, and she felt his steadiness as something physical, as a quality of the air between them. "You could have been hurt more," she said, and it came out with more direct feeling than she had meant to let through. He looked up at her from where he was sitting. She was standing close, the cloth in her hand, and his face was tipped toward the lantern light. "I'm fine," he said. "I know you're fine," she said. "I'm still saying it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said with a care that was its own kind of courage, "I'm glad you were out there. When I came out the last time and I saw you in the line, he stopped, and the stop was as telling as anything he could have said. She waited. I was very glad you were there," he finished quietly. She looked at him for a moment more, then stepped back and folded the cloth neatly. "The cut won't scar," she said. "It's clean." She did not say anything else about it that night, but when she woke the following morning she lay still for a moment and understood, with the clarity that early morning has when you haven't yet put up the day's resistance to honest thinking, that she was in love with James Redmond. She held this information the way her grandmother had taught her to hold things that mattered, carefully, without panicking, and with the intention of doing something sensible with it. By early September, the cookhouse had expanded in a meaningful way. Anna had added breakfast hours, which had created a second wave of daily business, and she had taken on a young woman named Marisol Reyes, 17, and already possessed of exceptional kitchen instincts, as a helper 3 mornings a week while Marisol's family assessed the wisdom of the arrangement. The Reyes family had been in this part of the territory for 2 generations, one of the Mexican families who had lived on this land long before it became a United States territory, and Anna was careful to treat Marisol with the respect owed to someone who actually knew this landscape and its ingredients better than she did. Marisol introduced her to epazote and fresh dried chilies, and the specific ratio of lard to masa that produced a tortilla worth the effort, and Anna's cookhouse became better for it. She was honest with Marisol about what she knew and what she didn't, and Marisol, who had encountered enough people unwilling to be taught by someone younger or browner, responded to this with an openness that moved their working relationship quickly past the formal stage into something that resembled a genuine exchange of knowledge. It was Marisol, obliquely, and while rolling tortilla dough, who first put the situation with James into words. "That rancher comes here every day," she said, not looking up from her work. "He does," Anna said, also not looking up from the bread she was shaping. "He sat outside yesterday for 20 minutes before you opened," Marisol said. Anna thought about this. "Did he?" "He did." There was a pause in which both women continued their work with great application. "He's a good man," Anna said finally. "Yes," Marisol said simply. "That's what I'm saying." James, for his part, was conducting himself with a restraint that was either admirable or maddening, depending on how you looked at it. He was attentive without being presumptuous. He helped when help was needed without making a production of it. He looked at her in ways that were clear enough to someone who was paying attention, and Anna was always paying attention, but he had not said anything direct, and she had begun to wonder whether his directness had a limit, or whether he was waiting for something, or whether she was entirely wrong about all of it, which she did not actually believe but felt obligated to consider as a possibility. The conversation, when it came, arrived not with great orchestration but in the plain way that real things tend to arrive. It was a Sunday afternoon in late September, after the cookhouse was closed for the day. She had gone for a walk along the dry creek bed east of town, which she did sometimes when she needed the particular quiet of land without buildings. The cottonwood trees along the creek banks had turned gold, which they did brilliantly in the New Mexico fall, and the air was sharp and clean in a way that felt like a gift after the heat of summer. James was there too, apparently for the same kind of reason, sitting on a flat rock above the creek bed with his hat beside him and his hands around his knees, looking at the cottonwoods. He turned when he heard her approach and stood, which he always did, and she said, "Sit down, I didn't come to interrupt you," and sat down on a neighboring rock with the comfortable directness that had become natural between them. They sat for a while without talking, which was easy with him. "The cottonwoods are good this year," she said. "They are," he agreed, more quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet, but the kind that has room in it. "Anna," he said, and something in the way he said her name was different from its usual register, slightly more weight on it, as though he had decided something. She looked at him. He had his hands around his knees still, and he was looking at the cottonwoods, and then he turned and looked at her directly with that specific Brown Creek water gaze. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for a while now," he said. "Say it plainly," she said. "I prefer that." A brief, honest smile crossed his face. "I know you do," he said. "All right, I think about you considerably. I think about you most of the time. I think about this town and what it is now with you in it versus what it was before, and the difference is not a small thing, not just the cookhouse," but he paused, and the pause had a weight to it. "You specifically, who you are. And I have been aware for a while now that what I feel about you is not the kind of thing a man should carry indefinitely without saying something about it, because that seems like a waste of time, and I don't much like waste." He stopped. He was still looking at her, and his expression was the open and steady one she had come to rely on. No performance in it, no protective irony, just a man saying a true thing and waiting. She looked at him for a moment in the golden September light with the cottonwoods catching the afternoon at their backs, and she felt everything her grandmother's sensibility would have had her way and everything her mother's warmth would have had her give freely, and both of those things were pointing in the same direction. "I think about you considerably too," she said, in case that was unclear. It was apparently not unclear. It had apparently not been unclear for some time, and the relief on his face was profound and real and had nothing performative about it. And then he reached across the space between their two rocks and took her hand, simply, the way you take something you're glad to be holding. They sat there in the late September afternoon with the cottonwoods going gold and the creek bed dry and dusty below them, and Anna thought, "This is the beginning of something that has been forming for months, and it has arrived without any drama at all, and that seems exactly right." The weeks that followed had a quality she would remember years later, with the precision of detail that belongs to things that leave permanent marks. He rode out to her cookhouse one morning and brought 2 apple trees, small ones in burlap bundles, that he'd been told could be coaxed to grow in this climate if you chose the right spot and watered consistently. And she had stood in the back of the cookhouse yard, and they had planted them together in the dry red earth. And afterward she had made coffee and they had sat on the back step and talked for an hour about nothing consequential, and it had been one of the best mornings she could remember. He invited her out to his ranch on a Sunday, and she went, and she saw what he was building there. A modest house that was solid if plain, a good barn, the 40 cattle spread across the grazing land, the fence posts he was still adding to expand the operation, and she understood from looking at it that this was a person who built things with intention and cared about what he built, which was something she recognized in herself. "It's good land," she told him, standing at the fence and looking across the grazing section. "It's getting there," he said, standing beside her, close enough that their arms touched. "What do you want it to be eventually?" she asked. He thought about this with genuine consideration. "A working ranch that earns its keep. A house that's bigger than what I need so it has room to grow into." He paused. "Something worth handing down." She heard everything in that and said nothing, but she turned her face toward the grazing land and felt something warm and settled move through her. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday evening in October, on the porch of the cookhouse after he had helped her carry in the last of the supply delivery from Berta's store. It was not a grand or sudden thing. She had been standing at the porch railing looking at the stars, which in the New Mexico territory had a clarity that she still had not finished being astonished by, and he came to stand beside her, and they had talked quietly for a few minutes. And then he had turned toward her and put his hand along her face with a gentleness that was also entirely certain, and kissed her in the clean night air with the stars overhead and the cookhouse behind them. She kissed him back with the fullness of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it, and when it ended they stood close together with his forehead resting briefly against hers, and she thought, "There is no version of this that I don't want. All of it, the work and the difficulty and this man beside me in the New Mexico territory night. I should have done that months ago," he said quietly. "You weren't ready months ago," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her. "How do you know?" "Because neither was I," she said. November came with cold nights and shorter days, and Anna's cookhouse became the warmest place in Cutter's Creek in a way that was not only about the stove. She had added a soup for every day of the week now, based on her mother's cards and supplemented by what Marisol had taught her about local ingredients, and the chili and potato soup that resulted from that combination had become the signature thing of the establishment, the thing people rode into town specifically for, even people from ranches 10 and 12 miles out. Berta Holt stopped in one afternoon, which she did with increasing frequency, and sat at the table with a cup of coffee and watched Anna work with the expression of someone confirming something. "You're good for this town," Berta said. "You've said that before," Anna said, not stopping her work. "I mean it more now," Berta said, "and not just because of the soup, though the soup is extraordinary." Anna smiled at the bread dough she was working. "He's good for you too," Berta said without transition. Anna kept working. "Berta, I'm just noting it," Berta said. "He's been different since you came, more settled." "He was already settled," Anna said. "They're settled and they're settled," Berta said with the air of someone who has considered the matter thoroughly. "The first kind is just being still. The second kind is being still because you're in the right place." Anna thought about this for the rest of the afternoon. James had a situation with a neighboring rancher in November that was the kind of problem that could have become serious in a different time or with a different man. The rancher's name was Carl Decker, and he was a bigger operation than James, about 200 head, and he had been steadily pushing the boundary of his grazing land in the direction of James's claim. It was not dramatic, it was subtle, the gradual moving of fence posts over months, the kind of thing that could be disputed or could be left alone, and Decker was counting on James to leave it alone the way smaller operations often left things alone when the larger one applied pressure. James did not leave it alone. He also did not make it into a confrontation that would leave hard feeling and potential danger behind it. He went to Decker directly, alone and without hostile intent, and laid out the specific markers and the measurements, and told Decker plainly that the boundary was where it was and he expected it to be respected, and that he had no interest in any kind of dispute but would pursue the legal process if it came to that. Anna heard about this afterward from Cliff, who had been near enough to hear some of it, and she thought about the way James had handled it, direct and without anger, willing to stand his ground without needing to make it theatrical, and she thought, that is a man who knows what he is and what he's not. She told him she'd heard about it when he came in for lunch. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Fine," he said. Decker moved the posts back. "Cliff said you were very calm about it." James lifted a shoulder. Getting angry would have just meant he went home feeling like he needed to save face. This way he went home with an out. She looked at him across the lunch table. "You gave him a way to do the right thing without it costing him too much dignity." He looked mildly surprised that she'd said it that way. "I suppose so. Is that good?" "It's very good," she said. "That's a hard thing to do." He smiled at his soup, the slow, full smile that still did the same thing to her chest as it had the first time she'd seen it. December arrived and the territory got cold in the way it does, sharply and thoroughly, and Anna had put extra effort into the cookhouse insulation, having added a second layer to the walls and new weather stripping around the doors. The apple trees in the back were bare and dormant but alive, which the neighboring rancher's wife, a practical woman named Dolores Gutierrez, had confirmed when she came in and inspected them. On Christmas Eve, James arrived at the cookhouse in the early evening with something wrapped in brown paper and sat down at the now customary spot at the end of the table nearest the stove. The room was warm and she had made a spiced cider that was filling the space with cardamom and apple, and there was no one else there because she had closed early for the holiday. He put the wrapped parcel on the table and pushed it toward her. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at it, then at him. "What is it?" "Open it and see," he said. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small cedar box, lighter and newer smelling than her mother's, with a brass clasp and her initials carved into the lid, AW, in letters that were neat but had the slight unevenness of handwork, of someone who had made this themselves. She opened it. Inside were 3 blank recipe cards in the same size as her mother's, and a small folded note. She looked at the box for a moment before she could look up, and when she did her eyes were wet, which she would have been annoyed about except that it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like the appropriate response to something that had understood her exactly. "For your own recipes," he said. "The ones you've made here, the ones you've made with Marisol, they should be in something that belongs to you." She pressed her lips together and then said, "The initials." "I did them myself," he said. "They're not perfect." "They're perfect," she said. She looked at the note. "In his handwriting, which was angular and careful, for everything you've built here, it deserves to be kept." She set the note down and looked at him across the table for a long moment. This man who had ridden 60 miles to find her a lawyer and planted apple trees with her and sat with her in the dark of evening and understood her without requiring her to explain herself. And she said, "James." "Yes," he said. "I love you," she said directly, the way her grandmother had taught her to say things that were true, without ceremony and without retreat. He was quiet for exactly 1 beat, and then he said, "I love you, Anna. I have for quite some time." "I know," she said. He laughed, the surprised, genuine laugh that she had only heard a handful of times and counted each one, and she laughed too, and it was the best sound the cookhouse had ever held. They were quiet for a moment after in the warm spiced cider air. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I'd like you to marry me," he said, and it came out straightforward and curt, and with enough weight that it was clearly a real question rather than a formality. "I want to build what I'm building with you in it. I want you and your cookhouse and your mother's recipe box and your grandmother's stubbornness and everything else." She considered him for a moment. Her grandmother's backbone, she thought. The thing she had carried here from Missouri across the whole of the country. The thing that had gotten her through the first winter and the cracked wheel and the land speculator and the loneliness of building something from nothing. The thing that had allowed her to stand up every morning and do what needed doing. Her grandmother had also married young, to a man her grandmother had chosen herself, and she had never in Anna's memory expressed a single regret about it. "Yes," Anna said, "I'll marry you." They were married in February of 1879 in the little church with the crooked steeple, by a circuit preacher named Callahan who came through every 2 months and conducted weddings, funerals, and Sunday services in whatever combination the territory required. It was a simple ceremony, but Berta Holt came and Marisol came with her mother and 2 sisters, and Pete Colby came. And Cliff came and brought 3 of the other regular cookhouse men who had collectively decided this event required their attendance. And Dolores Gutierrez came and brought a tamale dish that she said was a wedding gift, and that Anna had the recipe for before the week was out. Anna wore the best dress she owned, a dark blue wool that she had altered to fit better and added a collar to. And she carried a small bunch of dried lavender that Berta had found in her storeroom, which was the best option the territory offered in February, and James wore his best shirt and a coat that was clean and pressed, and that he had clearly put thought into. And they stood in front of Preacher Callahan in the small, cold church, and said the words that people have said to each other in ceremonies like this since long before the territory existed. When Callahan asked if he would take this woman to have and to hold, James looked at Anna and said, "I will," with the same direct certainty he brought to everything. And when Callahan asked the same of Anna, she met James's eyes and said, "I will," with a clarity that surprised even herself, because she had not known how certain she was until she heard herself say it. They ate at the cookhouse afterward, the whole small gathering, and Anna fed them from a menu she had planned carefully. Her mother's molasses bread, the chili and potato soup, the slow-cooked short ribs that had become the establishment's best-known dish, and for dessert the fried apple hand pies from the recipe card that smelled of brown sugar when it came out of the box. The cookhouse was warm and the evening was cold outside, and the gathering was the kind of small celebration that contains more meaning per person than a larger one can usually achieve. James sat at the head of the table he had helped her move, in the spot that had been his since the third day, with the end piece of bread she had reserved for him without thinking about it, and he looked at her across the table with the expression that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection, warm and deep, and with everything still going on underneath, and she thought, "This is exactly the life I meant to build here." Not the specific form of it that I imagined when I rode in on Gerald the mule, but the actual substance of it, which is better. The first year of their marriage was a full one in all the ways that mattered. Anna continued running the cookhouse, which had grown enough that she and Marisol were working together 5 mornings a week now, and she had also added an evening service twice a week, when the demand from the expanded ranching community made it practical. She moved her operations, her recipe box and her working supplies, to the ranch, which James's house had expanded to accommodate. A new kitchen had been added along the back of the structure, properly large, with good counter space and a second stove, built by Pete Colby and his nephew over the course of 2 months. James's cattle operation had grown to 70 head by the autumn of 1879, and he had taken on one permanent ranch hand, a young man named Abel Torres who was steady and good with the cattle and who had grown up working horses. The grazing land was productive, and the boundary with Decker remained respected, which Anna thought of as a quiet, ongoing victory. In the spring of 1880, Anna told James she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen of their house at the ranch, in the morning with the coffee still brewing, which was how real things happened in their household, plainly and without staging. He went very still for a moment, and then a kind of light came into his expression that she had not seen before and that she thought she would spend the rest of her life grateful to have put there. "Are you all right?" he asked first, because that was who he was. "I'm well," she said. "I feel fine." He crossed to her and held her face between his hands and looked at her with the full weight of everything he felt, which was immense and did not require elaboration, and she covered his hands with hers and they stood in the morning kitchen together for a long moment. "Are you glad?" she asked, because she wanted to hear it said. "Anna," he said, and his voice was rough with it, "I am so glad." She smiled and he kissed her temple and then her cheek and then, carefully, her forehead, and she thought, "This is the shape that love takes when it has been given time to form itself properly." Through the summer she continued her work at the cookhouse, accepting Marisol's increasingly efficient management with gratitude and stepping back gradually from the heavier kitchen work as the months progressed. James was attentive without being suffocating, which was the right balance, always aware of her, and always ensuring she had what she needed without treating her like something fragile, which she would not have tolerated anyway. She kept writing in her new recipe box, the cedar one with the brass clasp and her initials, adding the recipes she and Marisol had developed together, the modified versions of her mother's cards that had been adjusted for territory ingredients, the new things that had emerged from cooking in this particular landscape. The box filled slowly, with the same careful handwriting her mother had used, and she kept the original box beside it on the kitchen shelf, the two boxes together making something that felt like a conversation across time. She told Marisol one morning, and Marisol put down her dough and hugged her, which was unexpected and entirely correct, and then stepped back and said, "We're going to need to reorganize the schedule." And they spent the next hour doing exactly that, which Anna found immensely comforting. The baby was born in November of 1880 in the ranch house, attended by Dolores Gutierrez, who had considerable practical experience in such matters, and by the doctor from Las Cruces who James had gone to fetch 2 weeks early because he was not a man who left important things to chance. It was a boy. They named him Thomas, after James's father, with Wallace as a middle name for Anna's. Thomas Wallace Redmond arrived in the world at 4 in the morning with a substantial opinion about it, and James sat beside Anna's bed through the whole of the night, holding her hand through the difficult parts with a steadiness that she would remember always, present and warm and completely unshaken. She held Thomas in the early morning light and looked at his face, which was red and emphatic and entirely new to the world, and felt the largest version of the feeling she'd been holding since she rode into this territory on a borrowed mule with a cast-iron pot on her knees. "He's got your jaw," James said, from the chair beside the bed, his voice rough with exhaustion and something much warmer. "God help him," Anna said. James laughed, the low, real laugh, and took her free hand and held it. Thomas was a vocal and opinionated baby who became a vocal and opinionated toddler, with James's brown eyes and Anna's stubborn jawline, and a personality that seemed to combine the best organizational qualities of both parents in ways that were impressive in a 2-year-old. He went everywhere with Anna in the mornings at the cookhouse, strapped to her back in the way Marisol's mother had shown her, and then, once he was walking, stationed at his own small corner of the kitchen table with appropriate occupation while the work happened around him. He loved the recipe box, both of them. He would sit and handle the cards with a reverence that was funny in a small child, but also made Anna's throat tighten a little, as though something in him understood the significance without being told. "Recipe," he would say at 1.5 years, holding a card in both hands. "That's right," Anna told him. "That's your grandmother Clara's handwriting." He studied it with great seriousness. The cookhouse had become, by 1882, genuinely prosperous. Anna had formalized it into an establishment with a name. She called it Wallace's, which Berta said was too plain and James said was exactly right. And Marisol had become a full partner in the business in everything but name, which Anna corrected in the spring of 1882 by drawing up a paper that made the partnership official. Marisol was 21 now, poised and confident in a way that made Anna feel a particular pride, the kind that belongs to seeing someone become fully themselves. The second pregnancy came in 1883. This one was easier from the start, which Anna appreciated, and again she continued her work through most of it, and again James was the same steady presence he had been the first time, watching and helping and not hovering in the way she would not have accepted. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1883, and they named her Clara for Anna's mother without any debate at all. Clara came into the world with less urgency than Thomas had, and seemed content to observe her new situation with a wide-eyed consideration that made James say she had her mother's way of looking at things, which Anna took as the highest compliment. Thomas, who was 2.5, greeted his sister with the seriousness of a small person being assigned a significant responsibility, and patted her head gently with one hand, and said "mine," which Anna chose to interpret as protective rather than possessive. Through the years that followed, the Redmond Ranch grew and the cookhouse grew, and the town of Cutter's Creek grew around them both. And Anna and James grew together in the specific way that people grow together, when they have chosen each other not from desperation or habit, but from the kind of clear-eyed recognition that had happened on both sides from very early on. They argued sometimes, the way people who care about things argue, with full investment and the occasional raised voice, and the always eventual return to sense and goodwill. They disagreed about the pace at which to expand the cattle operation, and about whether the cookhouse needed new floors before a new stove, and about the best method for dealing with Thomas's third-year stubbornness, which was considerable. These arguments were real and resolved and left no sediment behind them. There were harder things too, the way life in the territory required. 1983 was a dry year, one of the driest in memory, and the grazing land suffered, and James sold 20 head at a loss to protect the remaining herd through the winter. And there were several weeks that fall where the household was tight and careful in a way that reminded Anna of her mother's boarding house years, the disciplined economy of people who understand that lean times require lean living. She adjusted the cookhouse menu to what was available and affordable, and Marisol brought in connections through her family network with suppliers further south that helped bridge the gap, and they came through it intact. James took on fencing work for Decker's operation that winter for additional income, which was not a comfortable arrangement given their history, but which Decker offered straight and paid straight, and James took it on the terms of a man who does what's necessary without complaint. Anna watched him come home in the evenings that winter, cold and tired and quietly determined, and made sure the house was warm and the supper was ready, and that she was there, present and without pity, which was what he needed and what she could give. She sat with him at the kitchen table and talked through the financial situation with the same practical directness they brought to everything, and together they managed it. By spring of 1884, the cattle numbers were recovering, and the cookhouse business had not flagged, had actually grown because it was one of the things people held onto in a difficult season, the reliable warmth of a good meal, and they were through the difficult year with the ranch and the partnership intact. Pete Colby died that spring, which was a grief. He had been in declining health for 2 winters, and it was not unexpected, but it was a loss nonetheless. And Anna organized the meal after the church service with the care she gave to everything, making the food he had most enjoyed eating at her cookhouse. And the gathering afterward had the particular quality of a community taking stock of itself and finding it still present. Berta Holt, who had been the first person to speak to Anna in Cutter's Creek 6 years earlier, sat beside Anna at the table and said, "He was very glad you came to this town. He told me once." "I know," Anna said. "He helped me with the roof." "He loved that story," Berta said. "He told it to everyone." Anna smiled. The roof did need fixing. The town needed fixing, Berta said, with the comfortable certainty of someone who has watched a thing happen and drawn the appropriate conclusions. "You fixed it. Not alone, but you started it." James was beside Anna, his hand around hers under the table, and she pressed it and he pressed back, and she thought about her grandmother Edith, who had never been to the New Mexico territory and never would, and what she would have made of all of this. She thought her grandmother would have looked at the cookhouse and the ranch and the 2 children and the man beside her and said, "Well, you didn't waste it." Thomas was 4 by then, all energy and stubborn questions, and Clara was 1, steady and watchful. Marisol had recently announced her engagement to a carpenter from Las Cruces named Miguel, and Anna and James had celebrated this at the cookhouse with a supper that Marisol called the best thing she had ever eaten, which was saying a great deal given who had made it. The summer of 1884 was good, warm and productive, and full of the particular satisfaction that comes from doing work you have chosen and doing it well. Anna expanded the cookhouse menu again, added a Saturday evening service that became the social event of the week for the expanded community of Cutter's Creek, which was no longer quite the same small, rough settlement she had ridden into. There were now a school, and a proper doctor's practice, and a second general store, and 40-odd households in town, and another 60 or so in the surrounding ranching area. She had found, gradually, that she had become one of the people who the town thought of when it thought of itself. Not the only one, and not the most prominent, but one of the handful of people whose presence had helped to define what the place was. This was not something she had sought, and not something she was entirely comfortable with being named aloud, but she acknowledged it privately as a thing that had happened, and held it with the same care she held everything that mattered. One evening in August, she was in the kitchen of the ranch house after the children were in bed, writing new recipe cards for her cedar box. The window was open and the August night was coming in, warm and carrying the smell of dry grass and the far-off sound of cattle moving. James was at the table across from her, working through the ranch accounts with a focus that was companionable rather than excluding, the comfortable shared silence of two people who had grown accustomed to working in proximity. She finished a card, the episode and bean soup that she and Marisol had developed, and set it in the box beside the others. She looked at the box, then at her mother's box beside it, then at James across the table. He looked up, sensing the pause. "I was thinking about the day I arrived here," she said. He put down his pencil. "What about it?" "I arrived on a mule named Gerald with a pot on my knees and no plan beyond the cookhouse idea," she said. "I had my mother's recipe box and my grandmother's way of dealing with things and nothing else." "That was enough," he said. "It was," she agreed, "but I didn't know that then." He looked at her with the look that had not changed in 6 years, warm and deep and attentive and entirely hers. "What were you afraid of then?" She thought about it honestly. "That I had come all this way and it wouldn't be enough. That I would build something and it would be taken or fall apart or just not be enough of a life. That the stubbornness wouldn't carry me as far as I needed it to." He was quiet for a moment. "And now?" She looked at the 2 recipe boxes, at the kitchen around her that she had designed herself, at the window with the August night coming in, at this man who had found her recipe and her backbone and loved them from the beginning. "Now I know it was," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his. The ranch house was quiet around them, the children asleep, the cattle settled, the night warm and generous. "The apple trees need checking," she said after a moment. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. In the autumn of 1885, Anna discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She told James on a morning in September at the kitchen table, the same way she had told him each time before, plainly and directly, and he received it the same way he had each time before, with the stillness and then the light, and the first question being whether she was well. She was well. She was, she told him, very well indeed. Marisol, now married to Miguel, and settled in a house at the southern end of Cutter's Creek, took on more of the cookhouse management during the winter and early spring with the competence that had always been there, and had been developing into something formidable. She hired her younger sister Lupe as her own kitchen assistant, and the Wallace's cookhouse continued its business with the same warmth and reliability that Anna had established from the first week. The 3rd baby was born in the spring of 1886, another boy, and they named him Samuel, for no family reason, but simply because it was a good name that suited him, and he arrived with more calm than either Thomas or Clara had managed, which Dolores Gutierrez said was a good sign for his character. Thomas was 6 by then, attending the new school, and Clara was 3, and convinced she should also be attending school immediately regardless of the school's position on the matter. The household was full in the way that households are when they contain growing children and 2 adults who remain genuinely interested in each other and in what they are building. By 1887, the ranch had grown to 120 head of cattle and James had taken on 2 permanent hands, both steady men, and the operation was generating a reliable income that, combined with Anna's cookhouse partnership, gave them a stability she had not dared to imagine on the day she rode into Cutter's Creek on Gerald the mule. She thought about Gerald sometimes, wondered what had become of him. She hoped he was still going sideways and giving his opinions about directions, somewhere pleasant. Berta Holt had slowed down considerably by 1887, was no longer running the general store herself, but had installed her nephew Garrett in the day-to-day management. She still came into the cookhouse 3 times a week and sat at the corner table and drank coffee and issued editorial commentary on the state of Cutter's Creek, which Anna considered an essential service and had no intention of discouraging. "You've done well," Berta said one afternoon in her direct and non-sentimental way. "We've done well," Anna said. Berta shrugged. "You started it." "Someone had to," Anna said. "Yes," Berta said, "but not everyone could have." Anna looked at the older woman, who had been the first person to speak to her in this town, and who had given her the information about the harness shop and the bolt of checked cotton for curtains, and the coffee that first week when Anna had been very tired and very determined, and not entirely certain either of those things was enough. "Thank you," Anna said, "for that first day." Berta waved a hand as though this was a small matter, which they both knew it was not. On a Sunday in the spring of 1888, Anna brought all 3 of her recipe boxes to the cookhouse. The original cedar box with the brass clasp, which now held 43 of her own recipe cards. Her mother's tin clasp box with the 37 originals in Clara Wallace's careful handwriting. And a third box, a new one, that she had asked Pete Colby's nephew to make before he moved to Colorado, built to the same dimensions as the first 2, which she had decided to start for Marisol. She set them on the shelf above the cookhouse stove where everyone could see them, all 3 in a row. Marisol came in and saw them and stood looking at them for a moment with an expression that was private and significant. Then she looked at Anna. "3," she said. "3," Anna confirmed. "Yours to fill." Marisol picked up the third box and opened it, looked at the blank cards inside, and then looked at Anna with the expression of someone understanding something larger than the immediate object. "My grandmother's recipes are in my head," she said. "I've never written them down." "Start today," Anna said. Marisol sat down at the cookhouse table, selected a card, and began to write. Anna stood at the stove and watched her and thought about her grandmother Edith, about her mother Clara, about the 37 cards in the tin box and the 43 in the cedar one, about the things that get carried forward when you carry them on purpose, about the specific act of writing something down so that it doesn't disappear when the person who holds it disappears. James came in at his usual time and sat at his usual spot, and she placed the end piece of bread in front of him without thinking, because she had been doing it for 10 years now and it had become part of her hand's own knowledge. He looked at the 3 boxes on the shelf, which were new up there, and then at her. "New arrangement?" he asked. "The third one is Marisol's," she said. He looked at the 3 boxes again, and she could see him understanding it, the full weight of the thing, and he nodded slowly. "Good," he said, in the way he said things that were good and real and worth the saying. She sat down across from him at the table, in the cookhouse she had built from a harness shop with borrowed tools and borrowed faith, and she looked at her husband in the afternoon light and felt the accumulated weight of everything that had brought them both here, all the difficulty and the uncertainty and the beauty of it, the way the territory land was beautiful, honestly and without apology. Thomas and Clara would come running in after school in an hour. Samuel would wake from his afternoon rest at the ranch house, where Abel Torres was keeping an ear out. Marisol was writing at the table behind her with the focused quiet of someone doing something important. Everything she had brought to this territory was here. Her mother's recipes, multiplied now and continuing to multiply, her grandmother's backbone, which had carried her to here and would carry her further still, and this man across the table who had loved both from the first day and had been loving everything since. She reached across the table and James reached back without having to be asked, and they held hands across the worn wood surface of the table that had been here since she built this place, in the cookhouse that smelled of chili and bread and the deep inherited warmth of 3 generations of women who understood that food was love made solid, that feeding people was one of the most direct ways of saying, "I have thought of you. I want you here. You matter." The territory light came through the clean windows she had fixed herself. The stove put out its steady warmth. Somewhere outside, A horse moved in the livery yard and the sound carried clearly in the spring air. "Happy?" James asked, not because he doubted it but because he liked to hear her say it. "Extraordinarily," Anna said. She meant it down to the bone, down to her grandmother's backbone that she had carried here and planted in this red earth, that had grown into something she could not have designed in Missouri because she had not yet known what shape it wanted to take. It had taken the shape of this town, this cook house, these children, this man, this life. The sun moved in through the window and fell across the 3 recipe boxes in a line on the shelf above the stove, all 3 of them holding what was worth keeping, all 3 of them still filling. And in the cookhouse that smelled of chili and warm bread and spring air, Anna Wallace Redmond and James Redmond sat together at the table they had made, holding hands across the worn wood, in the middle of the full and good and chosen life they had built, and were entirely and completely home.